The Founding and Religious Toleration, Lecture 2. So in the last lecture, I talked about the principle of free exercise, and then I talked about religion as with a freedom of religion as an unalienable right, and then talked about Massachusetts, which represented an example of a state where you had an affirmation of the free exercise of religion combined with the establishment of a church. But the establishment of the church was compatible with free exercise because nobody was forced to support the established church unless they were not supporting any other church either. So if you had different religious beliefs and you could prove that you were attending religious services and that you were supporting a particular religious institution, you did not have to support or attend the established church. But as I said, in Massachusetts, you are not free not to be religious. And in that sense, it was kind of like Locke, that the belief was because freedom requires moral citizens, and moral citizens must be pious citizens that believe that God is the origin and enforcer of morality, that therefore everybody had to have some religious and moral instruction. So that's a Massachusetts model. Now we look at the Virginia model, which is free exercise and disestablishment, no established religion. Although I did want to mention one other thing. I gave you a couple readings, a couple selections that from letters that George Washington wrote. This is pages 114 and 115. One to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, and another one to the Quakers. So to kind of religious minorities, you might say. And in both of them, Washington strongly affirms that in the United States, people have a right to worship in accordance with their conscience. Religious minorities are not merely tolerated, right? The language of toleration might imply, well, we don't have to let you guys worship the way you want to worship, but, we, the majority, out of the goodness of our hearts, we will tolerate you worshiping that way. And Washington says that's not the way it works. You have a right to worship in accordance with your conscience. And we, the majority, like the Protestant majority or whatever, we have a duty to respect that right. As he says in the third paragraph on page 114 to the Hebrew congregation, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Right? So as long as you're a good citizen, as long as you fulfill your duties as a citizen, you have the right to profess and worship in accordance with your conscience. And that is your right. That's not some gift that the majority gives to you. It's not some indulgence. It's your right. And he says that as well in the letter to the Quakers on page 115, where he says, the liberty enjoyed by the people of these states of worshiping Almighty God agreeably to their consciences is not only among the choicest of their blessings, but also of their rights. While men perform their social duties faithfully, they do all that society or the state can with propriety demand or expect, and remain responsible only to their Maker for their religion or modes of faith, which they may prefer or profess. And he goes on to say, and Quakers are exemplary citizens, except for the fact that they won't bear arms in conflict. And he basically says we kind of give you an exemption there, but other than that, you're great citizens. So I just wanted, alongside that statement from the New Hampshire Constitution, I wanted to show you a few places where Washington is very emphatic that the United States recognizes an inherent natural right to religious liberty. But so now we get to the Virginia Act, which is on page 122 of your packet, or 121, I'm sorry. So this is, again, free exercise plus disestablishment. Now, the bill has three parts, and the heart of the bill is actually part two, because part two is where you have the actual statement of the law. And this is on page 122. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. End of quotation. So there are a few things there. One, nobody shall be compelled to attend or support any church. So there you have the disestablishment. And the context for this bill was that the governor, I believe it was Patrick Henry, I think at the time, had proposed. He thought that a lot of people thought that the moral character of Virginians had been slipping since the revolution had ended. And so there was a proposal, hey, let's raise some public funds to hire some Protestant, pastors to go around holding church services and giving moral instruction. So something kind of like what Massachusetts envisioned. So that was the proposal, and Madison and Jefferson strongly opposed this on the grounds that forcing people to support a religion they don't believe in is tyrannical. And so they mobilized a counter movement within the Virginia legislature, which Madison was a part of at that time. And so instead of the bill creating publicly supported Protestant teachers of piety passing, you got the Act for Establishing Religious Freedom instead, which was authored by Jefferson. And there's a much more detailed defense of it authored by James Madison called A Memorial and Remonstrance. But I don't include that in your packet. You can read that if you want. A Memorial and Remonstrance. So, no one shall be compelled to attend or support any church, so no establishment. No one shall suffer in any way on account of their beliefs, right? And you remember that from Locke, that idea that nobody, neither the government nor private citizens, are allowed to harm other people simply because of their religious beliefs, right? And then the third thing is, so you're all free to express and defend your opinions without being affected in your civil capacities. That third thing, what they mean by that is that your religion will not disqualify you from holding office. I'll give you an example. So in Massachusetts, in order to be a member of the state legislature, you actually had to take an oath that you were a Christian. So non-Christians were not allowed to be legislators in Massachusetts. They were allowed to worship whatever their faith was, but they were not allowed to exercise political power. And a governor, as I recall, had to actually swear an oath that he was a Protestant. So Catholics could not be governor for a while. And so what the Virginia bill is saying, there shall be no religious tests. Your religion in no way will disqualify you from holding any public office. And that is embodied also in the federal Constitution. In Article 6 of the Constitution, there's a provision that says that there will be no religious tests for holding office under the Constitution. So nobody can be disqualified from holding federal office simply because of their religious beliefs, the way that, say, non-Christians and non-Protestants were disqualified in Massachusetts. So in Virginia, they're basically saying there's no religious tests. And then you also have, at the end of that, a very interesting addendum in Section 3, where Jefferson writes, "And though we well know that this assembly, elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies, constituted with powers equal to our own." So in other words, we know that we have no right to forbid future Virginia assemblies from making whatever laws they choose. And that therefore to declare this act to be irrevocable would be of no effect in law. So in other words, you pass this, but they can't say no future legislature is allowed to revoke this bill. Because you can't, any future legislature has the same authority as the current one, right? So you can't bind future legislatures. So they're saying, so even though we cannot declare that this act is permanent, they add this. They say, yet we are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present, or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural rights. So again, this assertion of the importance of natural rights, the freedom of free exercise is a natural right. And so even though a legislature is perfectly capable of passing laws violating this right, we are asserting that if they do so, they're committing an injustice. They're violating people's rights. So now, in some ways, one of the more interesting parts of the Virginia Act is Article 1, which is on page 121 and goes over to page 122. Article 1 is basically a preamble to the bill. So the heart of the bill is Article 2, because that's what actually makes the law. Here are the things you can and can't do. Article 1 of the Virginia Act lays out the reasons for the bill. So it's an explanatory preface to give the reasons for why this is being passed. And so it goes through tons of reasons for why religious liberty should be protected in this way. So, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens, or by civil incapacitations, so religious test for public office, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do. So, in other words, because God creates the mind free and wished people to freely come to the faith, and coercion of various kinds will not work in generating faith. So, in other words, this is an invocation of the Lockean reasoning for religious liberty. And they say that the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. So that's a second reason, that when imperfect, fallible rulers have had the power to impose religion, this has been the source of the spread of false religions. Giving the government the power to impose religion gives it the power to impose false religions, which they're saying here is a bad thing. This is an appeal to religious believers. Okay. Third reason. So each time you have one of those semicolons, it's a separate reason, beginning with that. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. That's a very strong statement. Forcing somebody to provide material support to a religion they do not believe in is sinful. In other words, it's an offense against God, and it's tyrannical. Right? It's a form of arbitrary imposition on those people. So it is wrong. It is unjust to force people to give of their own property and support to a religion they don't believe in. That's another reason. It's the third reason. Fourth reason, that even the forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern and whose powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness, and is withdrawing from the ministry those temporary rewards which, proceeding from an approbation of their personal conduct, are an additional incitement to earnest and unremitting labors for the instruction of mankind. That's a long one, but what they're saying is even forcing somebody to support their own religion can be wrong, because in a particular religion you might have several different churches, right? You think about most towns have several, say, like Baptist churches. And so even if somebody's already a Baptist, it's still wrong to force them to support a particular Baptist church because maybe they think the preacher at the other church is actually a better person and a better preacher. They should be free to choose which one of the representatives of their religion they provide their support for. And as they note, and that's a good thing too, because that provides an incentive to preachers to be good and moral preachers, right? Because if people are free to give them support and are free to leave their churches, they're going to work hard to be good preachers. Whereas if they have guaranteed support from the state, then that means that those preachers, potentially at least, can just sort of sit back and enjoy the support of the state, and they don't necessarily have to work hard on behalf of their parishioners. Whereas if your parishioners are free to leave when they're dissatisfied, you're going to work harder to support them. So basically what he's saying is the freedom to choose who you provide, which religious figures or institutions you provide support for, it's good for the person because it allows them to reward the people that they think are doing the best job. And it also kind of keeps preachers and religious institutions attentive to the needs and opinions of their flock, because they can't just sit back and collect government money. Okay. The flock is not forced to support them. That's another way of putting it, is that since the flock is not forced to support the pastor must earn the support of the flock. Okay. Next reason, that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than on our opinions in physics and geometry. So in other words, our opinions about religion are not relevant for determining our natural rights. Our natural rights are our natural rights because we are human, not because we hold this opinion or that opinion, right? In the same way that having wrong opinions about geometry do not disqualify you from having the right to life, liberty, and property and the like. So in the same way, having the wrong views on religion does not disqualify your right to life, liberty, and property. You have those rights as a human being, not as an adherent to a particular religion. Next reason, that therefore the prescribing any citizen as unworthy of the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument unless he professes or announce this or that religious opinion is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. So in other words, to disqualify people from the public trust because of their religion is to deprive them of their natural right to liberty. Now, that's an interesting claim because it implies that people have kind of a natural right not only to have their life, liberty, and property protected, but also a kind of a natural right to be involved with the public authority. And they're saying you do, and so therefore since that's a natural right, no religious opinion can disqualify you from having that right. And then they add next, that it tends only to corrupt the principles of that religion it is meant to encourage by bribing with a monopoly of worldly honors and emoluments those who will externally profess and conform to it. So, in other words, public support for religion actually has a corrupting effect, because you might get people who seek out religious offices and religious careers not because they genuinely believe, but because they're looking for a lucrative job. And so they're willing to conform to it. So there might be opportunistic hypocrites who seek out government-supported positions in religious institutions, and that corrupts religion. It's bad for religion. He says that though indeed these are criminal who do not withstand such temptation, yet neither are those innocent who lay the bait in their way. So in other words, yes, the primary fault if a hypocrite seeks out religious office is with that hypocrite. He's doing something he shouldn't do. But at the same time, it's blameworthy to create a situation where hypocrites might be tempted to seek out religious offices through things like the promise of a job and money. Next reason, that to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency is a dangerous fallacy which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he, being of course judge of that tendency, will make his opinions the rule of judgment. That's a very important one. So what he's saying there is, if you give the government the power to regulate religious opinions, to say, because remember, even Locke, and this is where they start to diverge from Locke, even Locke had said, opinions that are contrary to the public good do not have to be tolerated. In other words, it's not only acts against the public good that can be punished, but if people teach doctrines, if people encourage people to act against the common good, say advocate murder, those speech acts themselves can be punished because, as he says, the supposition of their ill tendency. In other words, out of the belief that if people believe this, then they're going to do bad things. Therefore, we should punish not only the bad things they do, but we should punish them for expressing opinions that cause people to do bad things. And what they're saying here is it's actually really bad to give the government the power to suppress opinions on the grounds that they will have dangerous consequences. And the reason why is because the government is going to be biased. What it'll end up doing is it'll use that power to suppress dangerous opinions. It'll say, in effect, those groups that disagree with me are expressing dangerous opinions, so I'm going to suppress them. So the power to suppress so-called dangerous opinions creates a pretext for the government to suppress opinions that it doesn't like. So it's going to be abused. So the power to suppress supposedly harmful religious opinions is going to be abused. And that's why they say, and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they shall square with or differ from their own, and that it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. So in other words, yes, when people break the law, punish them. But punish people when they break the law. Don't punish opinions. Don't punish wrong opinions, because the power to punish wrong opinions will be abused. Just punish wrong actions. And that becomes kind of like to a large extent, a kind of the standard American view. That's why in the United States, people have the freedom to advocate things that if they did them would be illegal. Things like I think murder should be allowed. You're allowed to say that and argue for it, and you're not punished, even though I think people would agree that if a lot of people thought that there was nothing wrong with murder, they would probably be more murders, right? So there might be a dangerous tendency in the opinion that there's nothing wrong with murder. Nonetheless, we don't punish the opinion. We leave people free to hold that opinion. But if they act on that opinion, we will punish them because murder is wrong. So it's the same thing with religion. And again, the basis for this belief is simply the claim that if you give the government the power to define and punish harmful opinions, they will abuse that. And they will basically end up defining the opinions they disagree with as harmful and use this power to suppress legitimate disagreement. So legitimate opinions will be suppressed out of partisan passion or whatever. Last reason. And finally, that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, and that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict, unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. So in other words, the best way to combat error is not through overt government suppression of bad opinions. It's through free exchange of opinion and ideas so that errors can be exposed and truth can be defended. That's the argument. And so because of all of these grounds, they argue that people should be free to profess and worship however they feel or however they believe, that they should not be harmed on account of their beliefs, that they should not be forced to support any particular religious teachers or institutions, nor should they be disqualified from any offices of public trust because of their opinions. And this is a natural right. So that is the Virginia Act. There will be one more lecture where I talk about kind of the limited way in which the founders believed that the government should actually publicly promote religion. So free exercise, yes, we will respect that. Establishment, no, for the most part. We're not going to establish churches, but that doesn't mean that religion should be invisible. But public support for religion takes another form. So that's what we'll get to in the next lecture.